In the world of entertainment, few mediums are as powerful as animation in terms of storytelling, in large part due to the fact that your imagination is in fact the only limit as to how far it can be pushed. It's essential for any form of contemporary production and is at least used in one of its forms. One of the most well-known forms is 2D animation, both traditional and digital. And for a few videos, we're going to delve into this medium and discover different facets of it. But before we go into any kind of dive in this vast ocean, we need to understand what it is first. And before we understand what traditional 2D animation is, we need to understand what animation is in the first place. So, what is animation? Much like all art, animation is an illusion. No, not in the sense that it doesn't exist. Rather, in the same way drawing is creating the illusion of depth, animation is creating the illusion of movement by rapidly sequencing a series of images, otherwise known as frames, that represent different points in time of a single action. Many techniques are used to create this illusion. The most notable 5 are as follows. Number 1. 3D computer animation, as is used in most video games, live-action movies, and the contemporary namesake 3D animated movies. Number 2. 2D vector-based animation, which works more like 3D animation in terms of workflow and uses pre-made 2D rigged models that are then posed and moved instead of drawing the different frames. Number 3. Stop-motion animation, using many different photographs of objects in motion to sequence the animation. Number 4. Motion graphics, which anyone that ever made a PowerPoint presentation or seen any video on any platform have witnessed this technique. And last but not least, our topic of interest, 2D frame-by-frame animation. 2D animation uses a series of drawings to simulate the movement thing in a two-dimensional plane. This includes characters, creatures, backgrounds, and effects. Every second of time usually has up to 24 frames. We refer to this as frames per second, or FPS. There can be as many as 24 drawings every second, meaning that every frame in itself is a unique drawing, or as little as 2 drawings every second. It depends on the kind of scene, the flow of the movement, and the amount of energy that is wanted to be conveyed. Safe to say, the more frames, the smoother the animation. But why call it traditional? Traditional 2D animation, also referred to as classical frame-by-frame or cell animation, is a technique in which each frame is drawn by hand with physical materials. Yes, it's indeed that simple, to give a definition, at least. We wouldn't dare say the same about the process of animating, however. Did you know that doing the actual animation is essentially the last step in the production pipeline? If we exclude cleanup, that is. There might be a misconception in how complicated the production process of any animated project is. No matter how complicated you think it is, it takes a person that actually worked on actual animated productions to know how arduous this process is. That being said, when everything has to be done manually, as for most things, it tends to get far messier and more complicated. Yes, even more than they are with all the technological shortcuts we have in this day and age. So, let me explain to you, as briefly as possible, how your favorite childhood movies are made. The first step, much like everything in life, is figuring out what in the world we are actually doing. We do that in a process known as storyboarding. It's worth noting that this step is not unique to animation, but is mandatory in every form of cinematography. It's a process in which a storyboard artist translates a given script into a series of images and scenes. Those scenes can also be put together in the form of animatics, which are slideshows that are meant to represent a vision for what the final outcome could look like, in terms of explorable scenes and story beats.
Come on.
Animatics can include voice acting and music, but remain relatively simple and minimalistic in these first stages, usually made by the same people that are pitching the project. Speaking of which, voice recording and music are the very next steps.
Your attention, please. Your attention, please. I have an announcement to make. I'm bored. Ha ha!
Due to the permanent nature of traditional animation, once a scene is made, it's extremely hard to make alterations without radically redoing most of the work that went into making the scene. Animators tend to synchronize their work to a pre-made musical track and pre-recorded voice lines. The movement of the lips and facial acting have to be matched perfectly with what the voices imply, and it's much more efficient to match the drawings to the voices compared to the opposite.
Not quite the word I was looking for.
Video recordings of actors making facial expressions and gesturing in the booth do make for fantastic reference. And then animatics come back again. Hooray! Obviously, it's important to test how effective the combination of music, voices, and images are at conveying the necessary story beats, but we'll skip over animatics as revisions are inevitable. Do bear in mind that animatics is a step that often comes back throughout the animation pipeline as a form of quality control. We will refrain from bringing them up any further and instead focus on the more unique aspects of traditional animation, such as what comes next, figuring out design and timing. After the final animatics are approved, they're sent over to a design team to figure out how the characters, props, backgrounds would look like in the final animation, and create the proper reference sheets for the animators to work off of. Now, you might be wondering, wouldn't they have figured out all of that before working on the production? The answer to that is yes, but actually no, not really. In the pre-production phase, as in world building and character creation, we tend to set looser guidelines to how the final product could potentially look like. Think of it as loose suggestions, many different iterations, and style exploration rather than finalized rules. Eventually, finalized designs have to be set in stone, and this is what this step is all about. While that is in motion, a timing director creates what is called an exposure sheet, where it breaks down the action, dialogue, and sound for every frame as a guide for the animation team. A bar sheet may also be created to show how every music note relates to the different story beats and dialogue within every scene. Once the designs are finalized, a layout team takes care of setting up camera angles, lighting scenarios, along with posing the characters in their respective scenes. Think of it like making keyframe art. This step is about finalizing the global layout of the most important part of every scene in the animation. And finally comes this animation proper. Now, we will go into greater detail on how 2D animation is made in another video, where we will discuss more in depth the different steps in the production pipeline. However, we'll focus today on what makes traditional 2D animation unique, and as we have established, it's in fact the physicality of it. The different frames that make the animation are drawn on what we call celluloids, hence the name cell animation. These are transparent sheets of paper that have holes designed to fit in peg bars positioned on animation desks to keep the papers perfectly aligned. While working, these holes also serve as a perfectly consistent point of reference between different frames for when assembly time comes. Said desks are also equipped with a transparent sheet of plexiglass that acts like a light box, which allows the animators to see through the different sheets of paper easier. Once a scene is fully drawn, it's scanned and synced with the audio in what is referred to as a Leica reel, and any necessary revision is made in a process called pencil testing. Once all is approved, the different frames are sent for cleanup. Every frame is carefully traced as cleanly as possible, making sure to stay as accurate as possible to the reference sheets, and to keep a consistent style throughout the entire process. Once that is done, we're ready to finally ink and paint. Just kidding, we still need to do the backgrounds, but it's still technically painting and inking. It's a very straightforward step. The background is, well, the background on which the scene takes place. An incredible revelation, I know. Anyways, it's only worth noting that these backgrounds are made in accord with the pre-established layouts and are usually painted with gouache or acrylic. Something opaque and vibrant usually does the trick. Now we can actually move on to the actual cells in a final step called ink, paint, and camera. The process starts by transferring the clean frames into the animation cell, in order for the color artist to paint on the opposite side of the cell with opaque permanent paint, again with something like acrylic or gouache. The transparent nature of cells allows for different objects and characters to be animated independently, and for all of them to be played on top of a resultantly blurry background. And that's how the photo taking process starts. The scene is laid out with the appropriate cells that are then flattened with a piece of glass to get rid of any possible warping, and clean photos are taken with a specialized animation camera. Once every frame is photographed, they get assembled in a final Leica reel, basically the cleanest kind of animatic possible, a finished animation, you may even say, and is sent away for the final post-production editing and assembly. That was quite an adventure, wasn't it? Traditional animation is a fascinating planet, but it's only a tiny planet on the vast universe that is animation. It's special, however, in the fact that this animation is in its most tactile, raw, and textured form. We'll talk about its other cousins in the near future, so be sure to stay tuned for when it happens. We hope you enjoyed this very brief introduction to the world of animation. Be sure to push that big red subscribe button and hit that bell for no other reason than to see the animation it makes, of course. Definitely only for science purposes. Anyways, like, share, leave a comment on what you would like to see next, and until next time, stay moving. Seriously, don't be afraid. Use up that high human FPS. That being said, thank you for watching as always, and see you next time.